speak. We're going to talk about some considerations for hoof nutrition. And as I was putting this presentation together, I kind of decided that what's good for the horse is good for the hoof as well. So this is going to be really one of our more general horse nutrition talks, but we will spend some time focusing on nutrients and management practices that are also extremely important for good hoof health. So when we think about the hoof, and we've probably all had our share of hoof problems throughout the years. If you've owned at least a couple of horses, then you've probably run into some hoof problems down the road. But there's a lot of influences on the hoof, and one I think that horse people don't do a very good job of recognizing is the role of genetics on the horse hoof. Typically, when we're breeding horses, unfortunately, in a lot of our industry, the hoof really isn't put very high priority-wise. And I've seen this time and time again in the show arena. Some of our nicer show horses are having to be shown in pads. And then also just even looking at the size of the hoof in comparison to the size of the horse gets a little off kilter here through our breeding program. Another thing to consider from a genetic standpoint is typically if you have a mare and you like her and she goes lame, she goes into the broodmare herd at a lot of farms. And so there's probably another problem that we have in our breeding program. But probably another big effect on or influence on hoofs is just general hoof care. And having a good relationship with your farrier, of course, is utmost importance. And just getting the farrier out on a regular basis that matches your horse's needs is extremely important. Some horses obviously can get by a little longer, and then you have other horses that really need very stringent hoof care throughout the year. Environmental factors play a big role on the hoof, how horses are housed. I'm a big believer in housing horses outside as much as possible. When I was in West Texas working with a lot of the ranchers and stuff, it was amazing to me how rough and rugged the terrain was, and these horses never even flinched. I brought two horses, this is when I was in Texas, I brought two horses from the east side of Texas over to Alpine, Texas, and my real hardy cow pony did just fine in the terrain, and then my appendix horse didn't fare well at all. I actually ended up selling him when I went back home. Just because he wouldn't do very well in that environment. So environment has a lot to do with how the hoof fares as well. And then we have nutrition. And it's kind of been my experience that people will tend to blame a lot of things on nutrition. So you have to be a little careful about targeting nutrients and expecting them to be the miracle cure for all your horses' ills, because that really doesn't happen. Nutrition is more of an art. It's a very holistic approach. It's all about balancing nutrients throughout the diet to really make an impact on your horse's health. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about. So if we look at nutrition, you've all seen these before and after pictures, and over here we have a colleague of mine got this Palomino mare, and she was in pretty poor shape, not necessarily thin, but definitely poor nutrition, poor health care, poor parasite control, bad teeth, whole kit and caboodle. And within 6 months, they were able to turn this mare around into, you know, a really nice looking little Palomino show horse made a great kids horse, in fact. And so this is within a 6 months period of time of just good management, good nutrition, quality nutrition. So that's what we're going to talk about, is just the quality nutrition program. And again, that's encompasses some of the nutrients that we put up as extremely important on the horse's diet. So we'll talk about protein, energy, minerals, vitamins, and we won't really talk about water in this presentation, but I do want to mention how extremely important it is for horses to have free access to fresh water. And where I live right now in Michigan, it becomes even more important even in the winter months because our water tubs freeze over. We have to keep a heater in them. And sometimes if you have older horses, they really don't want to drink that extremely cold water, and they can get dehydrated, which will lead to colic. So you want to make sure that your horse has access, not only access to water, but the water is at a comfortable temperature for that horse to really take advantage of it during the winter months. So we're going to start with protein, and really it's just where most nutrition talks start with. And protein is basically kind of the building blocks for all the body's tissues. Protein, if we break it down into components, we have smaller units of amino acids, and it's these chains of the different amino acids that make up the protein molecule. And so if we look at what protein does for our horse, it aids in the synthesis of tissue, enzymes. Enzymes are extremely important for basically every reaction that's going on in the horse is catalyzed by an enzyme of some sort. Proteins are important for the production of protein hormones, as well as antibiotics. But if we look at the hoof itself, and we were to dry it up, protein makes up about 90% of the hoof tissue. So the keratin tissue that is basically the major component of the hoof then is primarily made up of protein. And we talked about those smaller components of a protein molecule, the amino acids, and we can divide amino acids into basically two groups. We have our essential amino acids, and these are amino acids that a horse needs in its diet. And then we have the non-essential amino acids, and non-essential amino acids are amino acids that can either be produced or in sufficient quantity. So if we look at our amino acid profiles then, and we go back to our essential amino acids, when we're looking at feed tags, you'll usually see the amount of lysine that's incorporated into a feed product. And the reason why we place some importance on lysine is because it's called the limiting amino acid in a horse's diet. In other words, if we feed protein in such a way to where we're meeting the requirement of the horse for lysine, then we're pretty confident that we've also met the other amino acid requirements for that horse's diet. So that's why you'll see a lot of emphasis placed on lysine, and lysine is usually equated with protein quality in the diet. Some sources of lysine naturally in a horse's diet would be alfalfa is high in lysine, and soybean meal is very high in lysine. But some other amino acids that I highlighted are methionine and cysteine. And the reason I highlighted those is they contain sulfur molecules within their structure. And these are extremely important in the mechanism of the hoof. So a lot of times if you're looking at hoof supplements, you'll also see methionine and cysteine as part of the ingredients of the hoof supplement. But all in all, you really want to make sure that you're overall feeding a high quality protein diet that meets the requirements of the classification of the horse that you're trying to feed. So if we're talking about who needs protein or who requires the higher protein diets, as we look at the different types of horses you might be feeding, the young and growing horse is our primary concern when we talk about quantity and quality of protein. They actually have, for their body size, the highest requirement since they are developing tissue and they're growing muscle mass, putting down good, strong bone. So these horses require a lot of protein. Next on the list would be the lactating broodmare, and she needs more protein in her diet because she's feeding the baby there. So you want to make sure that that these individuals on your farm definitely have good quality protein in their diet. Our other horses, though, if we're feeding enough feed to meet their energy requirements, and we've got a sufficient amount of lysine in the diet or a high enough quality of a protein that we're being fed, then we're probably meeting their protein requirements if we're matching up with their energy requirements. But if you are feeding low protein diets, you're going to see obviously poor growth rates in the young horses, decreased appetite of horses. In other words, they won't eat enough feed. Fetal loss in mares, low milk production in our brood mares. You can see muscle loss as horses are deficient in either energy or protein. They'll utilize their reserves, which would be the muscle tissue, and they'll actually waste away in their muscle development. And then you'll also see poor hair and hoof quality with low protein diets. But actually in the adult horse, especially horses at maintenance and light work, it's extremely hard to get their diets to be protein deficient if you're meeting their energy requirements. In other words, if they're eating enough feed, and that feed is decent quality feed, to where they're meeting their energy requirements, they will also have access to enough protein in their diet. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to feed excessive amounts of protein in the diet, because for one, protein's really expensive. It's one of our more expensive feed ingredients when we're feeding horses. And if they have excess protein, they're usually just going to urinate it out, or they'll store it as fat. And protein is a pretty expensive energy source if you're feeding excess. It's also not very healthy from an environmental standpoint, because then you have excess ammonia that's being excreted by your horse. So as we continue on then, kind of the take-home message from a protein standpoint is the amount of protein that can be digested and absorbed into the blood and the amino acid composition of the protein determine the actual protein quality of the diet. So the next nutrient we'll focus on is energy. And energy is required for just basic maintenance of the horse. So that pasture pet that's standing out in the stall still requires energy for basic function, thermal regulation, digestion, just maintenance of their body system. And then we have all horses require energy for basic digestion and then production. And we can break down in horses production into their workload as well as reproduction and growth. So if we look at our energy sources then in the diet, we will focus on primarily carbohydrates. Horses are going to get most of their energy from carbohydrates, and sometimes even the name carbohydrates sends shivers up and down horse owners. But it's actually horses couldn't live without them. And in some respect, fats can also be added to the diet to be used as an energy source. What we don't want to do is try to utilize protein as an energy source. Keep your protein for tissue building blocks, but don't increase protein if what your horse really needs is just more energy. There's just better ways to get energy into the horse. So we'll talk a little bit more about carbohydrates because that seems to be kind of scary and confusing. Carbohydrates can be broken down into non-structural carbohydrates as well as structural carbohydrates. Now our non-structural carbohydrates consist of our sugars and our starches, and these are the carbohydrates that are very easily digested in the small intestine. And then our structural carbohydrates would be more of the fibrous portion of the diet. And our structural carbohydrates are primarily digested in the hind gut by microbial fermentation. So if we look at our feed resources, and if we think about forage as kind of being the base of our feeding program for horses, the forage is, while it has some non-structural carbohydrates, it's primarily made up of structural carbohydrates. Whereas if we look at our grains, grains are primarily made up of our non-structural carbohydrates. So when we talk about sugars, probably the sugar that is most associated with a lot of problems in the horse would be fructan. And fructan's gotten a lot of publicity as it's found to be a trigger for laminitis in some susceptible horses. Fructan is a complex sugar, and it actually ends up being digested in the hindgut versus the small intestine. Fructan can be found in your cool season grasses. So if you live up north and you're feeding varieties of timothy, orchard grass, brome type grasses in either your pasture or hay, you're more likely to see fructan in those cool season grasses. And the fructan can vary quite a bit. It can vary as much as 5 to 50% in those forages, depending on the time of the year. And so what you'll find is fructan increases when the plant is stressed or when the plant is growing. And photosynthesis, as the plant grows, the plant will accumulate fructan in its stem. And then as it gets colder then at night, the fructan will slowly not be as accessible to the horse. And then by mid-afternoon, though, you're starting to see fructan concentrations in pastures creeping back up again. So again, fructan can be a trigger for laminitis in certain susceptible horses, and we're going to talk a little bit about insulin-resistant horses later in the presentation. But we want to manage our horses on spring pastures especially. very carefully. And with horses that are either overweight or known to be insulin sensitive, then we don't want to graze those horses during the early spring pastures. They're just too high in nutrients overall, and we'll also be seeing some concentrations of fructan in there that could trigger some bad reactions. Some other measurements we can take would be to feed hay before we turn horses out on spring pastures, just so they don't rush out and gobble up as much as they can on an empty stomach. We want to be extremely careful as we gradually introduce spring pastures to horses, and we always advise to just start out with 15 to 30-minute intervals over a few weeks, and gradually increase the amount of time then that horses are exposed to pasture. Now, if horses are out on pasture winter through the summer, a lot of times they will themselves acclimate to the new pasture. So you just have to know your horses as well. You want to restrict grazing though with horses that are known to be insulin resistant, that are also overweight or easy keepers. And you can kind of look at these horses in this photo. These horses are pretty darn fat, so and that pasture looks pretty good. So that, for me, just looking at that scenario, is kind of a recipe for disaster. And then we'll also talk a little bit about using grazing muzzles to help control forage intake in susceptible horses. But another carbohydrate that gets a lot of attention is starch, and starch is also higher in grains. As we look through our list here, you can see your alfalfa, grass hay, grass pastures are really low in starch. But then when we get into our grains, oats, corn, and barley, we're starting to see really high percentages of starch content. And this is why we have to be careful with diets that are pretty dependent on the grain portion. So if we look at what's going on in the horse when they're taking in large amounts of starch, we have problems with overflow of starch into the cecum. And within the cecum or the hindgut, we have a microbial population there that's just ready to gobble up whatever comes its way. If it's used to primarily eating forage and you introduce a high load of starch into their population, they basically go rampant and take in as much as they can, secreting a lot of lactic acid along the way. And then as the microbes are harmed really by eating this foreign feed to them, then you end up with production of endotoxins. And so you have a real disruption then in your microbial population in the gut. And it's this trigger of lactic acid and endotoxins that can lead to laminitis in the horse. We also talk a little bit about structural carbohydrates. Now, these are the carbohydrates that you'll see more of in your forages than you will your grains. Grains have a small amount of structural carbohydrate, and that's the seed coat that surrounds the grain. Oats are a little higher in fiber than corn because of their fibrous coating. But all in all, your fibers, your grasses and your legumes are going to contain your structural carbohydrates. And this is what is in the cell wall of the horse. So we have hemicellulose. That's a little bit is the most digestible of the structural carbohydrates. We have cellulose, and then we have lignin that really just passes on through the gut and isn't digested in any meaningful way. Your forages are digested in the hind gut primarily through fermentation, and they can actually be used as a major energy source for the horse. And we know that you should feed at least 50% of your horse's dry matter intake in forage. And it's really important. And most veterinarians that you would talk to, most nutritionists would say, we'd really rather see the forage to grain ratio be closer to 75% to 25% for most horses. Horses that are strictly lawn ornaments, adult horses on maintenance, can actually do quite well on forage diets alone. Forage is also just the stimulation of the fibers in the gut, promotes a healthy gut, and also gives horses a real psychological satisfaction of eating. So it's pretty much what their system was designed to do. So we've talked a little bit about the foregut. Our proteins are simple. Carbohydrates are digested in the digested and absorbed in the foregut, and then our more fibrous portions of the diet are digested primarily in the hindgut. So we're basically, when we're feeding horses, we want to think about that hindgut microbial population, because what we feed them will dictate the kind of microbes that populate your horse's hindgut. And so if they're primarily doing well on a fiber type diet, and then all of a sudden, let's say they get into the grain bin, they bust into your feed room and gorge on a bunch of grain, now you're going to throw that population all out of whack with that ingestion of starch into their diet. So that's where we see the major acute colics and founder coming on. So anytime we do any type of diet change, we want to do it really slowly so that we don't disrupt this microbial population. And if we do feed concentrates in the diet, then we want to feed them in small amounts frequently through the day. So, textbook would say don't feed any more than 5 pounds of grain in any one feeding to a 1,000-pound horse. But a lot of times if you talk to veterinarians, they would actually like to see that amount about halved. So 2 to 3 pounds of concentrate per feeding is probably plenty for most of our horses. Another nutrient that's used for energy would be our dietary fats. And fat can actually provide energy a little bit over twice as many calories as most of your grains, traditional grains that we feed. So it's a really robust source of calories for the horse. And if you have a horse that needs a low starch diet, but still needs the calories, then fats can really come into play in developing your feeding program. Your traditional grains only contain about 2 to 3% of fat. So horses, we know through research, horses can easily handle 5 to 15% of dietary fat. So a lot of times in your senior feeds where you're trying to decrease your carbohydrate load, but also increased your caloric intake, you'll see fat supplementation used. Horses that have real high caloric needs, you know, your race horses, polo ponies, jumpers, eventers, those horses can usually really benefit from supplemental fat in their diet. So all in all, when we're talking about energy for the horse, we want to look at how much energy they actually need. And one of the easiest ways for me anyway to kind of decide how much should I be feeding my horse isn't necessarily by knowing how much they weigh, because that's only one part of the story. Knowing how much your horse weighs doesn't take into any consideration in their actual body composition. So you can have two 15-hand horses. If one horse is really heavily muscled and the other horse is very light muscled, but they both weigh 1,000 pounds, then you can bet that the light muscled horse is going to be fatter than the heavy muscled horse, just from a body composition standpoint. So we use body condition scoring to decide how much energy our horse needs, or if we want to keep them at the same. And our body condition scores range from 1, which would be extremely thin horse. So one of these horses you see that's just in horrendous neglected type conditions, where you can basically see every rib, their backbone, their hips. They have no muscle mass whatsoever because they've had to utilize all their muscle stores for energy just to keep on their feet. And then we go to the other extreme on a 9, which is that horse that's extremely fat, so fat that they're crusty over the neck. If you look over the top of their back, they have a huge dip going along their back, lots of fat over their tail head. There's really no delineation from the shoulder to the barrel to the hip of the horse. They just look like one big fat tube going down their side. And so that would be the extreme of the body condition score of 1. Well, for most of our horses, we actually want them right in the middle at a body condition score of 5. And as we think about a body condition score of 5, we really don't see any excess fat over the top of their neck. If we look over their top line, they're pretty much level. We don't see that crease that you would with a fatter horse. We see some delineation from their shoulder through their barrel or rib cage. We don't see any ribs, but if we palpate our hands over their ribs, we can easily feel their ribs. And that's kind of a key to a body condition score of 5. We can't see the ribs, but we can easily feel the ribs. We don't feel like we have to get a pickaxe and dig in to find a rib on a horse like you would the body condition score of 9. So this is a really good way to keep track of where your horse is at from an energy standpoint. If you need to reduce the amount their energy intake, increase it, or just keep it the same, keep it status quo. So quickly then, some other nutrients that are associated with hoof structure would be minerals. And if you look at your hoof supplements, a lot of times you may see calcium and phosphorus as well as zinc and copper. And the reason you're going to see these together is because it's extremely important that calcium and phosphorus, zinc and copper are balanced together. So you don't want to just target shoot with one or the other of these minerals. But these are really important for the construction and the maintenance of the hoof. I put selenium in here because if selenium is toxic for long or if a horse is getting too much selenium over a long period of time, it's actually pretty toxic to them. And you'll see noted hair loss. They can actually experience erosion of their long bones, but you'll also see cracking and sloughing of hooves. So if you look at the map, in Michigan, we're actually one of the states that's selenium deficient. So we talk a lot about making sure you have adequate amounts of selenium in the horse's diet. But I know that there's other regions here throughout the country that there's pockets where there's actually too much selenium in the soil, where you have to be concerned with chronic selenium toxicity in the horse's diet. By and large, if you're feeding a good quality concentrate and you're feeding at least 3 pounds of that concentrate, your horse is getting the recommended levels of selenium in their diet. If you have concerns that your horse isn't getting enough selenium, rather than trying to give them an injection over supplementing in that way, you're better off just to try to balance out your feed program so that they're just getting that daily intake of selenium that they need. You can even use salt blocks with added selenium to help ensure that your horse has enough selenium in their diet. But probably the vitamin or the nutrient that gets the most attention associated with the hoof is biotin, and it's one of the only nutrients that through research has been shown to improve hoof quality in some horses that had poor hoof quality to start with. So there's some variations in the results from different researchers, but I think on the whole, it's well accepted now that if you're feeding around 20 milligrams of biotin to a horse that is already on a balanced diet but still has poor quality hooves, that there's a pretty good chance you're going to see some improvement in that hoof quality. Now, it's going to take 6 to 14 months, so that horse has to go through a full growth stage of incorporating new hoof growth to really see an improvement in hoof strength as well as hoof growth rate. But many horses will respond positively to biotin. Now, does this mean that we need to supplement biotin to every horse? Probably not. If your horse is on a balanced feeding program and you're happy with their hoof quality, then there's really no rationale for feeding them supplementing biotin on top of that as a preventative. We just don't know that it works as a preventative with hoof quality. So you're probably better off saving your money and spending that on good farrier care, to be real honest. And then we'll just touch on, we've already kind of talked about laminitis, but some of the causes of laminitis are overeating, working on hard surfaces, high fevers, exposure to black walnut shavings, and we have black walnut trees all over our farm, and you actually have to be concerned. Let's say you grind up a stump. You want to remove those shavings from your pasture so horses aren't exposed to those shavings that are left on the ground, or those chips left on the ground, or even exposed roots. There's some old nutritional papers looking at thoroughbred farms in Kentucky where some brood mares foundered because they were standing under walnut trees with exposed roots. So you want to be careful picking out your shavings, getting them from a reputable source. But some other risk factors are ponies just seem to be bred to founder, and it's nothing, there's nothing wrong with the pony itself. It's really how we manage ponies, because ponies were really bred to be hardy and live off of really sparse resources. But then we take these little guys and we put them in nice pastures. Maybe we even feed them grain, and they're just founder waiting to happen. So we have to be really careful with our ponies, our donkeys, miniature horses from that respect. Older horses as well seem to be more prone towards laminitis, and part of that is the development of equine Cushing's syndrome. Horses that are around 20 years of age are may be susceptible to developing Cushing's. We'll talk about that in a second. There's no relationship to dietary protein and laminitis. We're primarily concerned with carbohydrate intake when we talk about nutrition and laminitis. So overfeeding concentrates is one problem that we see. We want to make sure, again, that we feed a balanced ration, that we start the ration on forage, and then we feed concentrates as needed. We need to be extremely cautious with turnout time and pastures. Using a grazing muzzle can actually be very helpful for some horses that tend to overeat out on pasture. And again, we just want to optimize the forage portion of our diet. Equine metabolic syndrome will lead to laminitis. And these horses are basically insulin resistant, and they will experience chronic laminitis over a time period. If we look at these horses, you can sometimes identify them by their really crusty neck, and they'll tend to have pones of fat around their tail head. I've seen horses with equine metabolic syndrome that actually weren't that overweight, but they still had just very unusual fatty deposits over their top line. So some triggers for equine metabolic syndrome would be just overfeeding, keeping our horses overweight. So if they already have a genetic predisposition towards this tendency, overfeeding them is really going to push them over the edge. These are horses that usually you really can't turn out. You're better off to just house them in a dry lot to where you can monitor their forage intake. As we treat these horses, then we reduce their calories. You can actually soak hay to decrease the sugar content of the hay. Even if you soak hay for about an hour, you're going to decrease the sugar content by about 40%. So that's another good tool if you are trying to work with one of these horses. Obviously, you're going to have to work closely with both your farrier and your veterinarian to try to get these horses serviceably sound. Equine Cushing's disease looks a lot like equine metabolic syndrome. Both horses are insulin resistant, but the reason why is very different. So with our equine Cushing's horses, that situation is primarily caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland, and it leads to a series of hormonal imbalances. You usually don't see this in horses until they are in their 20s. And it's pretty easy to recognize even without testing them. These are the horses that don't shed out in the wintertime. They keep kind of a long, dull hair coat on. They have excessive sweating. They're probably a little more tired. They may drink excessively, urinate a lot in the stall, keep a really wet stall. They're going to really start to lose their muscle mass along their neck and top line. And again, they're going to be very prone to experiencing just kind of that chronic founder. One thing you can do, it's quite costly, but with daily administration of pergolide, um, you can actually turn these horses around fairly quickly. And it's probably worth the money if you're trying to keep these horses serviceable, especially if you have kids at home that can benefit from them. You want to feed low starch, high fiber based diets. If a horse needs extra calories, you can supplement with fat. And also you want to make sure you body clip these horses. So I'll just end with some general feeding rules. You want to feed horses individually by their class, what their actual requirements are. You want to monitor horses' their intake by how much body condition they have, how much fat storage they have. You want to measure your feed out so you know by weight how much you're feeding. Make sure that it's balanced with forage versus concentrate. Again, you want to maximize the forage in your horse's diet. Decrease the amount of starch either by decreasing the meal size or how many times during the day you're feeding grain. Provide plenty of fresh water and salt. If you are buying a feed, don't from the feed store that's specialized for your horse, don't dilute that balanced concentrate by cutting it with oats, or some people cut it with corn in the winter, because you're really just taking all of the calculations that a nutritionist has worked on for your horse and dumping it out the window. So if you buy bagged feed, that's really the way you need to feed a concentrate ration. And then obviously you want to practice good parasite and dental care with your horse. So there's some really good resources at extension.org horses. There's learning lessons as well as a lot of webinars on these very topics at My Horse University. And there's also some cool apps now. One is a horse body condition scoring app. That helps you body condition your horse as well as keep records of that scoring system. There's a healthy horse calculator that'll tell you if you're feeding your horse too much or not enough based on its weight. And then there's a hay price calculator that I find helpful when I'm trying to get the best deals on hay. So those are just some resources that you'll find at both of these websites. And with that, Jeremy, I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, fantastic job tonight. And I'll mention too that we'll put those resources on the webpage. So if you didn't have a chance to write those down when the webinar is live as a video tomorrow on AmericanFarriers.com, we'll put links to those websites and to those apps. So as a reminder, if you look on the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see an area for submitting your questions. We have a few already, so we'll go into those, but by all means, please type those in and we'll go through as many as possible. First question we have here is someone has a rescue horse and severely malnutritioned. Curious about trying to get it back to more of that 5. Is it a gradual approach to recovery in terms of feeding? Or I guess maybe they're looking for a little bit of insight on that.
Sure. I guess my approach would be all the high quality forage that horse would take in, and a lot of times those horses can do well on pasture. It's not really the time of year for pasture for a lot of us, but a lot of times you can slowly introduce those horses to pasture as well as the high quality forage. But I would also start very slowly introducing a nice balanced concentrate into the horse's ration, potentially one that actually has high fat to it. And it's not that you want to you want to keep, I would keep that forage to concentrate ratio about 75% forage and only 25% ratio, and go for the kind of a moderate weight gain as you go through there. And that way you can monitor the horse's reaction too as they get on a better nutrition plane. Sometimes you can't really recognize those horses that for maybe a genetic predisposition might have problems with metabolic disorder and stuff. So taking those horses, a little bit more gradually maybe is a little safer way to go. Obviously, you want to make sure that horse is on a good parasite control program, as well as make sure that their teeth are checked out and they've got good dental health, because usually horses that come in that condition, as you well know, it's not just the feeding program that's gone awry, it's everything else with that horse, probably no vaccinations or anything like that, so complete health care redo. But great question.
Okay. And then I think this is probably more in a case of moderate or certainly not severe cases, but what are some of the signs of poor diet when just only looking at the hoof?
Well, again, you kind of have to factor in. I would be a little cautious about, always, going in the direction to where if you see poor hoof quality, then you're automatically equating it with poor diet. Because if you look at the horse and everything else is looking pretty good, feeding a horse is again more of a holistic type thing. It's all about balance and stuff. So it's hard for me anyway to really target the hoof, without looking at the entire picture. But I will say this, from the research, horses with poor hoof quality, as far as maybe they're more prone to cracking, thinner walls, slower growth, definitely respond, at least many of them will respond to increase in biotin or really good, well-formulated hoof supplements. So that's one way you can kind of tell. It's not necessarily that your nutrition program is bad. It could be that that particular individual, they just need more to maintain good hoof quality than the average horse would from those specific nutrients. So that's probably not a great answer for that question, but it's as good as I can do.
Okay, great. Can you repeat why methionine, lysine, and cysteine are so important?
Well, we do know enough studies have shown, like in growing horses, that young horses that are fed very low protein diets have a slower hoof growth than horses fed what would be considered a more balanced protein to energy ratio, so enough protein to help facilitate growth. So we definitely know that amino acids play a role in hoof quality and hoof growth. Again, I don't know that necessarily targeting those particular amino acids is necessarily the correct approach. I think more importantly, it's that you're feeding a high quality diet and the correct amount for the classification of horse that you're feeding. So for me anyway, I'm not convinced that it's necessarily isolating those. Methionine and cysteine are usually the two amino acids that you'll see kind of isolated from a hoof quality standpoint. I would tend to take just more of the more balanced approach, making sure that all of your essential amino acids are met in the horse's diet. Again, paying attention to lysine, because usually if lysine is met in the horse's diet, the other amino acids will also be present in the correct amounts.
Okay. On a horse that is foundered and has been shown to be sensitive to feeding, would you recommend Bermuda or alfalfa? What would you recommend it to be fed with concentrates as well?
Okay, so this is a horse that's recently foundered. They're being fed a mixed forage of Bermuda and legume hay.
Uh,
So is that
that doesn't say
correct?
what it's currently being fed, just asking between Bermuda or alfalfa.
Oh, between those two as well as what type of concentrate?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you have to look at, so what potentially is the cause of the founder? And if this horse is overweight, or shows signs of being insulin resistant, then you or for that matter has Cushing's, then you want to definitely monitor its caloric intake overall. So I would prefer to put that horse on a grass hay, so your Bermuda grass, and I would feed it a low starch diet concentrate if I'm going to feed it a concentrate at all. Another good way to go if you have overweight horses and you're concerned with laminitis is to, if you're feeding that grass hay, is to supplement with a hay balancer. So it kind of looks and feels like a concentrate, but it has a lot less starch in it, and you don't have to feed very high quantities of it. So it's fortified with your protein. Sometimes it even has a little bit of fat supplementation to it if you still need more energy resources, but you don't want to feed the starch or sugars in the horse's diet. So that would probably be the route I would take.
Okay. Another question. There appears to be a popular theory that an excess of iron in the diet from soils, feed, and water sources may be mimicking or causing metabolic symptoms similar to insulin resistance. What can you tell us about this? And if it's true, how can we as farriers guide horse owners to help prevent excess iron intake, or how to balance iron's effects of supplementing with other materials like other minerals like zinc and copper?
Right. Well, I haven't come across with literature too much in regards to iron and metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. I know that a few people have tried to touch on it, but I don't think there's been a real body of research to really correlate that with laminitis, at least not what I've seen at this point in time. Uh, Primarily, iron, most horses just are not going to be deficient in iron. People who are people who do high intensity type work equate that to meaning that their horse needs iron supplement, and so they'll purchase these iron supplements. I guess the best thing that I would tell anybody to do, regardless of what classification of horse they have, is you probably don't need to feed the iron supplements in the first place. It just doesn't bear out that horses are going to be deficient in iron to start with, just because they have a heavier workload. So I would just get the iron out of the picture. But in a normal diet, you shouldn't really be concerned with too much iron in excess to where that might cause significant problems. But again, I haven't come up with a lot along those lines.
Okay. Here, this one's asking you kind of look in your crystal ball. Thinking about what you might see in research journals, what do you think is the next frontier of our understanding of equine nutrition?
Ooh, boy, that is a good question. I think we still have a lot to learn. We're way behind other species, I think, on protein metabolism in the horse. I don't think we still have a great understanding of the microbial population and how important that is to the horse's digestive system, and how we can best keep that population healthy and working in our favor. So I would think hindgut and maybe protein metabolism are at least areas that I would like to see more work done in, for sure. And that would be across all stages of growth and then aging as well.
Okay. Could you define CP percentage requirements in hay analysis for idle and low maintenance horses to meet lysine and other limited amino acid levels to maintain structural and immune integrity, meeting NRC minimum guidelines of 132 grams CP per 400 kilogram weight?
No, so I'm having a hard time believing somebody typed out that long of a question. But I think what you're asking for is crude protein requirements for the average horse out maintenance horse, I think is what I gathered from that. And for an adult horse, your crude protein requirement is going to be relatively low. And as long as you're working on a diet that's around 10% crude protein, because those horses' requirements are pretty low, just being out on maintenance, you're probably going to be meeting their amino acid requirements as well, including lysine. If horses have access to green forage, fresh forage, then they're always a step ahead of other horses. But those maintenance horses, their requirements aren't that high to start with. So usually I'm more concerned with those horses giving them too much nutrition than not enough nutrition.
Okay. Someone here, let's see, a question about handling excess arsenic in the water at a farm being purchased. Do you have any information on toxic levels of arsenic for horses and how to mitigate any potential toxicity or excess arsenic side effects?
Ooh, no, I don't. And it's funny because I've actually written some stuff on water quality where I know I've come across arsenic for those very reasons. And you raise a really good point, though. When you're purchasing property, or even if you're having trouble on your farm with horses, you need to look at water quality and testing. As far as if you have high levels of arsenic in your water, gosh, I don't think there's any management practice you can do besides giving them an alternate water source. To make sure you don't run into problems from that standpoint. But that is just off the top of my head. So yeah, I would that would be a pretty big concern.
Okay, and we'll have two more questions. Let's see here. Um, let's take a horse that's foundered from outside influences. such as road founder. Have you ever seen anything in studies that might recommend changes in diet that might help, I guess, maybe turn this horse around, or would it be possible for anything in their diet to further negatively affect that horse?
Well, if the founder is caused by more of a physical consequence versus a nutritional interaction, then I'm not sure that nutrition is going to help or hurt the horse that much. You definitely, though, don't want to do anything that would add injury to the horse. So if that horse is overweight or is being fed a really high starch diet, then you're going to have to, I would definitely suggest addressing that situation. The other standpoint is if you have a horse that's being laid up, any horse that's being laid up, you want to make sure that you decrease the amount of energy that horse is receiving. And that's something that sometimes we tend to forget. We'll have a horse that's injured and is undergoing stall rest, for 2 to 3 weeks, but we don't adjust how much grain we're giving that horse. We're giving them the same amount of caloric intake as if they were being ridden or exercised. So anytime you have a horse that's going to be laid up for any amount of time, you want to decrease their caloric intake to match up their new needs.
Okay, and then the last question, what would you recommend as a supplement for helping a horse who has a body score of 5 but extremely thin, poor quality hoof walls?
Yeah, I would just find that supplement that has the biotin in it at 20, where you're dosing them about 20 milligrams per day. And then after that, I think everything else that you'll see in that supplement is kind of icing on the cake. So a lot of times you'll see the zinc and you'll see the methionine, a cysteine added in to those supplements as well, maybe even calcium and phosphorus. But the primary ingredients that I would be looking for would be the biotin, and ensuring it's getting fed in enough quantities and giving it enough time to see if it makes an impact on your horse's hooves.